Eating oysters today is like a luxury. But in the 1800s, they were basically street food, with Americans eating a billion every year. Oysters had been feeding people long before that. Indigenous communities along the Chesapeake Bay had been harvesting them for thousands of years, often in ways that sustained the reefs themselves. Archaeologists still find enormous piles of shells, called middens, left behind, and the oyster reefs themselves were massive, rising like huge underwater hills. So, knowing this, I knew I had to cook one more oyster recipe before closing this chapter. The question was, which one? Looking at menus from the time, you could see that oysters weren't just a dish, they were life, served many different ways, even in the same sitting. And this was big business. So it wasn't whether you ate oysters, it was where you ate oysters. Maybe you were in a working man's tavern in Baltimore eating oysters with brown bread and a bottle of beer. Or you were sitting in an elegant oyster house in New York, like the famous restaurant run by Thomas Downing, a black restaurateur who became one of the most celebrated oyster dealers in the country, serving only white elite. Because I am talking about an entire economy here. I mean boats, fishermen, packing houses, railroads, street carts, and of course, restaurants. For many people after the Civil War, oystering was a real opportunity. And by the late 1800s, they were even being packed in ice and shipped inland as far as Chicago. Black watermen made up a large part of the workforce, some as deckhands, but others saved enough to buy their own boats and work independently. In fact, my own great-great-grandfather worked as an oysterman in the Chesapeake Bay during the 1870s and 80s. But when an industry gets this big, feeding cities, making fortunes, people start fighting over it. And that's exactly what happened. Watermen began battling over oyster beds and harvesting methods. Some used large dredges that scraped the bottom of the bay, pulling up huge harvests, but destroying the oyster reefs. Others used traditional hand tongs. The conflicts became so intense that Maryland created an armed force to police the area. Patrol boats chased illegal dredgers, with sometimes violent skirmishes, becoming known as the Oyster Wars. And somewhere in the middle of all that were the watermen who depended on oysters to survive. People who had to find a new way to make a living once that boom came crashing down. 85 to 90% of those oyster reefs are gone now, mostly from overharvesting, dredging, and pollution, making the oysters of today feel like a luxury. But their story is really about abundance, and abundance is never guaranteed. It's something each generation has to decide whether to protect.